One can't necessarily understand these things as a philosophy. Postmodern conservatism is a kind of symptom of our postmodern culture. If you try to understand it philosophically, it'll make very little sense because, of course, there's all kinds of incoherences, tensions, bizarre manifestations of what I'm talking about. But when you understand it as a symptom of our postmodern culture and our neoliberal society, it makes a lot more sense why you'd see this kind of reactionary politics emerge.
Today is Wednesday, April 13th. The year is 2022. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. All right, well, welcome back to another episode of No Easy Answers, a Marxist podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. Today on the show, we've got Professor of Political Science Matthew McManus here to talk to us about his book called The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism. Some of our listeners may already be familiar with Matt by way of the critical theory podcast Plastic Pills. I know that I've been listening to Matt and the guys over at Plastic Pills for a long time, and I throw those guys a few bucks per month on Patreon to access their bonus content. And depending on how long you've been listening to No Easy Answers, you might have caught our previous episodes featuring guests that have also made appearances on Plastic Pills, such as Professor Benjamin Teitelbaum and Professor Ronald Biener. Now, Matt and I sat down to discuss his book about 2 months ago, and I intended on releasing this episode after the interview I had with Cam Scott. But you know, life happens, things happen, and then there was a week when a decade happened, and so we are just now getting to publicly release this episode. Listeners who subscribe to the No Easy Answers Patreon have had this interview for a little while, and right now is a really good time to join our Patreon because behind the wall you can unlock lots of cool bonus content, including a 5-person listener hang I did with Mel Buer from Protein Magazine and the Morning Riot podcast, Max Alvarez from the Real News Network and the podcast Working People, Francis Madsen with the Real News Network, and author and grad student Christopher Nivens. You know, I'm thinking I would like to continue doing a roundtable discussion every few weeks since this first listener hang went so well. I mean, I wasn't expecting this, but the conversation was really open and vulnerable, attempting to confront some really difficult questions about revolutionary trauma and how we create a better world without recreating the same systems of oppression we struggle against. And we just published to our Patreon part 1 of an ongoing conversation with Alexander Herbert. He's a historian of the USSR and author of the book called What About Tomorrow? And What About Tomorrow is like an exceptional book detailing the punk music scene that emerged in Russia from the late 70s all the way up to the early 2000s. So there's lots of cool stuff you can unlock right now. And as always, your Patreon contributions are deeply appreciated. I mean, there's a lot of time and effort that go into each and every episode of No Easy Answers. And our Patreon is, of course, the best way you can possibly support the show. But if you can't join our Patreon right now, or if you still want to support the show, but you can't commit anything monetarily, that's cool, man. You can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can share these episodes on your social media, and you can join our Discord. I'm attempting to invite folks into a community because I think my listeners are extremely thoughtful and socially conscious people who aren't looking for simplified answers to the world's problems. And so to that end, I'm always happy to receive feedback about our episodes, answer any questions on topics we've covered, or if you just want to say hi, we've set up several ways for you to do this, and you can check the show notes for links to all of that. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Matthew McManus. It was a real treat for me to be able to sit down and speak with him about counter-Enlightenment thinkers and how this school of reactionism gave way to postmodern conservatism. Matt is a really busy guy, and he has a ton of students, and so I just really appreciate him scheduling time between classes to speak to me about his book. So here's my conversation with Matt McManus. All right, we have the great Matt McManus on the show with us today. Welcome to No Easy Answers. Matt, I'm sure that, this podcast is politics, philosophy, the human condition, mostly from a Marxist perspective. But I and I'm a big fan of yours and the things you contribute over at the Plastic Pills podcast. Lately, I've been reading through your book, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, and it has been a long, strange trip to get to this point where a person like me who is interested in radical theory is now finding an interest in like pipe smoking, elbow patching, English statesman conservatism. Like, you know, at first observation, man, you know, you wouldn't think something like that would be radical or interesting. And, you know, it's really difficult to like, how do you find something interesting out of someone who's like, I'm a prudentialist? I mean, like, what is there to the word prudent? If you're describing attitudes and outlook, it's not like a system of politics. I just, you know, I've been down this long rabbit hole, like I was telling you before we signed on off the recording, about how, like, you know, there's new stuff out on Nietzsche, the Lacerdo translations, and I've talked with my friend Daniel Tutt over at the Jouissance Vampires pod about all of this. He actually just got done with like a 3-day symposium on Lukács and the destruction of reason, which was all really cool. And all that
sounds fun.
Yeah, it was super cool. And I kind of, you know, in a way, it was a weird sort of companion unexpectedly because, you know, I've been reading through your book. I've been really looking at the French Revolution and I'm looking at the Enlightenment. And I got very interested in what Isaiah Berlin called like the counter-Enlightenment, kind of irrationalism and these series of thinkers that kind of gave birth to conservatism that are kind of, in your book, you say you're not trying to point out that these thinkers in the school of irrationalism or this tradition of irrationalism are, you're not trying to frame them as postmodern conservatives in gestation, but you're just kind of showing how this type of outlook could arise under certain social conditions, which is a super cool premise, and I really did your book. So I
Thanks, man.
Yeah. So I'd like to start this conversation out with some questions about your book, obviously, but and some of those thinkers. But before we dig in, just as a matter of my own personal curiosity, would you tell us what inspired you to write this, who the audience is you were writing for, and can you speak a little bit about how your work and research came to focus on postmodern conservatism?
Sure. Well, I should say thanks again for having me on here, and I'm glad you liked the Pill Pod. I'm sure that Pills and all the others will be happy to hear that. But look, you know, I was always interested in the political right. Part of that's because I had a bit of a weird upbringing. I grew up in a pretty conservative town in Canada. Most of my friends from the town were right-wing. But then, you know, I went to art school and high school, and then I was, you know, became a lefty at some point, you know, in undergrad. Not even sure when it was, but at some point that all clicked, right? But even when I was doing my undergrad, you know, I'd go to conservative meetings, try to learn what they were talking about. I was always curious about the other side. And to be honest with you, for a long time, you know, I started my master's, then I did my PhD. All that kind of went to the wayside because, you know, Barack Obama was president. Not that we shouldn't be critical of him, but, you know, Stephen Harper was kind of moderate conservative here in Canada. There just was really no reason to pay attention to that. But then, as you all know, circa 2015, a big buffoon went down a golden elevator, said some nasty things about Mexicans, and then kickstarted a campaign that eventually brought him to the White House. And like a lot of people, I'm not going to lie, I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win 2016. I'll never forget, you know, it was me and a bunch of my radical friends. We were all over at my apartment in Toronto, and we were drinking, and we were all talking like, oh, we're going to have to write this op-ed talking about how Hillary Clinton just represents a continuation of neoliberalism, you know, all the kind of typical stuff. And then we were like, oh my God, like, he actually looks like he might win. And we were like, no. And then sure enough, the night ends, and we had President Donald Trump. And we were all like, well, fucking, we need a stiff drink to get through this evening. And there were several. But, you know, the next day I woke up, and after my hangover was cured, I thought to myself, like, look, I really need to kind of understand what's happened, both for my own personal edification and education, but also because I think there's now a real political purpose in trying to understand this a little bit better. And one of the things that I realized, and people like Corey Robin have pointed this out, is that as a leftist, I hadn't actually paid very much attention to the conservative tradition for a long time. Right? You know, during my graduate degree, I'd gone through Edmund Burke and Justice de Maistre and a few others. But, you know, it was time to go back, crack open those books, to try to develop some kind of theory for what was happening. So around 2017, I was reading a lot of this stuff, and coincidentally, around the same time as Kellyanne Conway made that quote about alternative facts, I was reading some Frederick Jameson and Edmund Burke at the same time. And I guess it was just that kind of alchemical mix of all those things together. I was like, oh, postmodern conservatism. That's what we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not the one who coined that term. I should be straight up with that. As far as I know, Sheldon Wolin was the one who coined the term postmodern conservatism in the 1980s. Or it might have been Peter Lawler, who actually identified as a postmodern conservative. But obviously the meaning that I'm giving it is a little bit different, more Marxist, I'd say, in many respects than what the others would use it for.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was really enjoying your book because I've been, man, I've been trying to decipher conservatism. Is a certain interest was piqued into why does it seem so incoherent? Why? And maybe it just has to do with reactionary politics as it is simply being a process of constantly reacting to external stimulus that don't have any pattern or any sort of discernible pattern to them, so that's why it can seem kind of random, incoherent. It can be, CRT one day, Mr. Potato Head the day before that. Sort of figuring this stuff out was always kind of strange to me. And the only thing that kind of made it even take some sort of sense was kind of researching these thinkers. So the rise of postmodern conservatism, it's kind of one part a history of ideas as it pertains to postmodernism in society. And then it's a genealogy of early thinkers who led us into contemporary conservative and nationalist movements. I mean, it's quite an undertaking to attempt to summarize the scope of what you do concisely in this work. So maybe you can set the table for this conversation by defining a couple terms. I mean, I hate to ask you to define postmodernism and neoliberalism at the start, but I think it'll do our listeners good to ground us in this conversation. So if you wouldn't mind kind of defining postmodernism and separately neoliberalism. And then maybe as a second question, could you say a few words about something you mentioned in your book? You said, quote, neoliberalism is an inherently revolutionary form of governance.
Okay, man, you asked one of the easiest questions on this podcast.
Cool.
What is postmodernism? What is neoliberalism? Really short. I'll try not to, be long-winded. If I am, make sure you cut me off. But what I talk about is postmodernism as the kind of cultural logic appropriate to a neoliberal society. And again, this isn't my innovation. It draws very heavily on the work of people like Fred Jameson, Dave Harvey, Wendy Brown, a lot of similar thinkers who've done fantastic work, both in the Marxist tradition and in a kind of post, or at least Marx-influenced direction. But long story short, neoliberalism is an economic mode of governance or logic that is revolutionary in the sense that it fully unleashes the logic of capital across the body politic. And it tries to get different human subjects to internalize the logic of the market in their own lives in a way that's virtually unprecedented, right? Neil Vallely, by the way, wrote a really good book about this recently called Utilitarianism. But he says, look, one of the things that's, endemic to neoliberalism is the idea that we aren't just wage laborers any longer, in the sense that we sell our labor to a capitalist for a wage, and then, they get to expropriate that. We have to transform ourselves into a kind of human capital. And I'd point out that now with the rise of social media, not only do we have to transform ourselves into a kind of human capital, but there's a hyper-real dimension to this because, of course, now we're trying to transform our image and the way that we're perceived in a lot of these spaces into a kind of human capital, right? So this is something that's really distinctive about neoliberalism that you haven't seen in earlier epochs of capital. And there's more to it than that, but that's kind of the core of what I was getting at with the book, right? Obviously it has kind of economic side and the work of the Montpellier Society and Vienna School of Economics, all very interesting, but let's put that aside for a minute. When I was talking about postmodernism, again, it's the kind of cultural logic that I associate with this neoliberal society. And it's worth noting that there's two ways that we can understand postmodernism. One is a kind of skeptical philosophy that mainly originated in France post-1968. You see it articulated in the works of people like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. Jean-François Lyotard actually kind of straddles both camps, but let's put him in there. And generally speaking, all these thinkers had very interesting things to say, articulating new skeptical arguments about many of the major claims of the Enlightenment. Sometimes their skepticism is overstated because a lot of them actually had nice things to say about the Enlightenment as well. But, they problematized some of the more universalist dimensions to that. That's all very academic and all very good. But what I was interested in, again, is what you find in the work of Jameson and Harvey, where they say that what's interesting about the kind of skepticism that you see in these pomo authors is that actually you can see it in the broader society also, in all kinds of different, sometimes really fucked up, sometimes very interesting, sometimes even in emancipatory forms. And we need to understand this culture as a symptom of neoliberalization, and for that matter, also situated in the broader transition towards modernity brought about by capitalism and then late capitalism.
Gotcha.
So I'm interested in postmodernism as a culture more than as a philosophy. You can't really disconnect the two analytically, since obviously they feed into one another, but that's the way I distinguish it.
Right. So in part two, when you start out, and thank you for that, by the way, thank you for defining those. I think that'll ground us in this conversation just so we have like a nice starting point. Now, as far as like your genealogy of these early postmodern thinkers, right? The first one that you kind of touch on is Edmund Burke. And I have to say that as a Marxist, like I've never really felt compelled to go back to the days of the French Revolution and read what an English statesman thought about it. But your book kind of helped foster a particular interest, and mostly because I felt that perhaps I would be able to decode like contradictory and irrational behavior of contemporary conservatives. But, it seems like in pointing to Burke, I was expecting, like I was kind of just ready to contest with a battle of ideas. I'm like, okay, I'm going to read this elbow patch, pipe smoking guy, whatever. I'm going to read about what his ideas were, and and then I come to find out it's not really like a set of premises that are spelled out. It's more like an outlook, and I think you referred to him as a prudentialist in your book, and it's really hard to like critique or be mad at someone who's just trying to have a prudent outlook. And so I'm hoping maybe you can say a few words about Burke and why he's so difficult to nail down. And for our audience that like is a lot of Marxist actually, what of Burke's outlook would specifically like Marxists take issue with?
Well, there's a lot that Marxists should take issue with, and we'll get into that. But look, I mean, the characterization of Burkeanism as an outlook is not articulated by me. It's articulated by Russell Kirk, who's a conservative interpreter of Burke. And what he means by this is that conservatism isn't connected to belief in an abstract set of principles, right? This distinguishes it from something like liberalism or Marxism, right? Because liberals tend to believe in some kind of system that's oriented around principles of equality and liberty. Now, different liberals have different ways of interpreting liberty and equality, but this is what they're committed to, right? The best society is one that upholds those. Marxists and socialists obviously also have an abstract set of principles that they're connected to. Utopian socialists believe in utopian egalitarian economics. Marxist socialists tend to believe in the science of history, to evoke Althusser's term, and that sooner or later the kind of dialectic of history will run its course and we'll wind up with a socialist and then a communist future, right? That's putting it really crudely, but let's just put a pin in that, right?
Yep.
And Kirk, with Burke, says that's not the way conservatives look at the world, right? Because these abstract ways of thinking about things, they believe, at least, are unrealistic, or they're not grounded in lived experience. And so Burke, again, as you pointed out, drawing upon his experience as a statesman, says that when you don't look at the world in terms of abstract principles and then compare things as they are to those abstract principles, then you become someone who's predisposed towards supporting incremental change. You believe in organic transitions rather than radical or revolutionary transitions from one way of organizing society to another. You also appreciate the fact that most people don't really care that much about politics. They're focused on their little brigades and the kind of micro concerns that are involved there. And extrapolating from that, we can understand society not as a kind of formal organization dedicated to a set of principles, but rather as a kind of organic hierarchy where everyone has their place, each individual has their role, and it more or less functions pretty harmoniously as long as nobody contests that too much. Things start to become problematic when people, especially in the lower orders, cease to support their role or cease to believe in their role in the system, or they think that the people at the top are oppressing them. And that's where you see this kind of revolutionary agitation. And interestingly, Burke kind of anticipates all the Ben Shapiros and Dinesh D'Souza's and all those other fuckfaces in the world, where he says, normally the masses would be complacent. The problem lies with these kind of elite intellectuals, these philosophes in all their coffee-swilling ways, who come along and convince the people that they're oppressed, and that there are these abstract principles that society doesn't abide by, including equality. And so they need to rile themselves up and go and change things. And Burke will often say, if these intellectuals didn't exist, the masses would be quiet, but they do. And this is why we see the emergence of, to use his infamous phrase, the swinish multitude that brought about the French Revolution. So it's pretty complicated, right? And I'll get into why Marxists should be critical of this. But But, as you pointed out, you can see this in the style of Burke's writing. He never sits there and says, premise A, this is how society should be organized, premise B, whatever, right? He kind of just hits the ground running and then argues from what he thinks at least to be lived experience and common sense even.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was reading, while I'm reading your book, man, I was like looking up different lectures and stuff like that, and I found a lecture from a nice Ivy League university on Burke, and I almost like spit my coffee out like the third sentence in when this guy said that he said that Edmund Burke was a more radical writer than Marx, because Marx didn't like sufficiently break with John Locke enough, or sufficiently break from some of the tenets
is this
of the Enlightenment.
Ian Shapiro?
It might have been, might have been, yeah.
Yeah, I know the lecture you're talking about.
Okay.
My wife actually likes that lecture a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it was some really good points that he made about like kind of how the Burkean notion of human nature is kind of fumbly in the dark, and that we don't know what kind of consequences to our actions will have the ripple effects later on. And so this constant outlook of caution on the part of Burke, which was an interesting illustration. Again, not a whole lot of substance to chew on if you're looking for like, as a Marxist, something to really sink your teeth in and critique, but yeah, it seems like it's funny. It's like, if there's one thing that's really cool already out of this interview is that you've already said that, conservatives are not tied to any sort of abstract principles.
Well, they believe they're not. I actually would say that they are, but we can come back to that later on.
Okay, gotcha. Well, let's move on to Joseph Maistre then, to Joseph de Maistre, because he was kind of a relatively new name that to me anyway, because I had never heard of this person. I was looking up Isaiah Berlin and listening to his lectures, and Berlin like condemned him as like the father of fascism. And to me, given that we've had all these discussions on like Nietzsche lately with the Lacerdo text, that was really
great book, I should say.
Yeah, like I mean, I haven't read the full 1,000 pages. It's a tome, but like from what I've read and from what I've gathered and the conversations I've had, like it's just been something that I've been chewing on myself about, like what's to be done with Nietzsche now. Like now that we've looked back on him, and some of us have broke with him now and interpret him a little bit differently. But if we're all kind of feeling like we're living in the Weimar Republic 2.0 at this point, and we are looking at the origins of fascism, to have someone like Isaiah Berlin call somebody the father of fascism, it immediately perked my interest. And, and obviously, like, de Maistre, like, he predates Nietzsche, but I'm thinking that for anyone reading up on that Lacerdo text, or anyone that's maybe revisiting Jeff Waite's Nietzsche's Corpse, and for that matter, anyone that's had an interest in, like, the destruction of reason by Lukács, de Maistre is kind of a missing figure in those works, but I think he's relevant to the projects of those texts. And so I wonder if you could paint a picture of de Maistre's importance to the history of irrationalism, and why Isaiah Berlin depicts him as the father of fascism, and maybe how it's like helpful to think of de Maistre not as a monarchist, but as someone who kind of established political ultramontanism.
Absolutely. I mean, de Maistre is a fascinating thinker from a left-wing perspective. And the reason he's a fascinating thinker is this, right? So just to kind of segue out from our Burke lecture, Burke often appeals to a kind of prudentialism, even a common sense realism. But as any leftist will know, conservatives will talk a lot about common sense and then start talking about these very abstract seeming ideas, the nation, God, Western civilization, all these things that seem a little bit odd. And you see this in Burke's work from the very beginning, where even in his early work, he writes about how it is that people tend to approach the world in one of two ways. Either they approach it with an apprehension of the beautiful, which is small, controlled, something that reason can understand, and that we can manipulate for our purposes. And there's a parallel to that in his writings when he talks about things like these little brigades, town halls, traditionalism, all that kind of nice stuff. But then he also points out that there's another dimension to human life, which is apprehending the sublime, which is tremendous, powerful, something that you subordinate yourself to, and that human reason can't understand. And he compares society to this as a whole, right? Where he says most of us can understand our kind of little brigades and our little activities in life, but nobody can understand the sublime whole that is society. And because we cannot understand it, there's something sacred about it. So, of course, how dare you think that it's within your power to understand society, let alone think you can revolutionarily change it, right? And of course, this notion of the sublime is very, very much ripe for ideology critique. Think about the sublime object of ideology, right?
Right.
Now, Burke sometimes backs away from these more grandiose kinds of ways of thinking about things, in part because he was, good Englishman. He wasn't entirely critical of the Enlightenment. This is where I think somebody like Shapiro was wrong to characterize him as a kind of radical critic of Enlightenment. He accepted elements of it grudgingly, but he accepted it. De Maistre goes exactly to the extreme, right? Where he talks about how Enlightenment philosophy is, to quote his text, Considerations of France, a fundamentally destructive force, because what they don't realize is that society needs to be treated, and authority within society, as a dogma, right? You approach it like you would a religious creed. That's another way he puts it, where you obey, you believe, and you do not question. And that's exactly the sin of the philosophes, that they question too much. And associated with this belief that unthinking reverence for authority is a good thing, at least on the part of the average person, maybe not on the part of the people who believe or hold up the system, which is a self-initiative question, is de Maistre's argument that if the sublime power which authority figures and society hold over society is corroded by too much criticism, then what we need to do is bring out the real person that's going to instill the fear of God into you, which is the hangman. Again, his terminology, right? And he has a very interesting discussion of the need for violence in society, because he says the reason why the hangman is the real glue that holds society together and imparts upon it the sublime quality isn't just because he instills the fear of death into you, right? A bandit could instill the fear of death into you, but you wouldn't kind of associate it with this. It's because it imparts upon authority this kind of God-like veneer, right? Where they wield power over life and death for the entire body politic. And that makes people naturally predisposed to supplicate themselves towards those authorities, right? And it's not coincidental that he says, in response to the French revolutionaries, that what Louis XVI should have done is just massacre a whackload of them and do so very publicly, right?
Right.
Make an example of them. And then he says everything else would have been fine. He didn't bother to do it because he was worried with these kind of humanitarian, he was kind of a cuck king, if you want to use the different terminology. And so, he wound up getting, interestingly enough, kind of what he deserved in some respects. Because again, if you read de Maistre's writing, a lot of what he's directing his attentions towards is the failure of reactionaries in France to respond in the way he's describing. And he says, in many ways, you have no one to blame but yourself for the fact that the Ancien regime fell, because you didn't have the balls to go in there and just put the people back in their place where they belonged. And you could have done that because the resources were there, but you gave in to all these kind of wishy-washy sentiments, in part because you drank too much of the Kool-Aid of liberal philosophy yourself.
Right. Wow.
So very interesting figure. Not to everyone's taste, even on the political right, I should say. He is much, much more appealing to far-right figures contemporaneously. But he's had a profound impact, not just in terms of specific philosophy, but also tonally, like the way he writes, the way he's deliberately provocative, scandalous even, on right-wing discourse going forward.
Right. Yeah, it seems like when I was listening to Isaiah Berlin speak of the way de Maistre depicts human nature, it seems like the sort of his depiction of human nature is beyond Hobbesian. Like you think of Hobbes as this obviously the quote, the brutish and short, life is nasty, cold, brutish and short. And you think of the war of all against all, and de Maistre just depicts it as like this continual cycle of like predator-prey, destroying hierarchically one another, as if all of this is not only natural but just like should be obvious. And that's the kind of the way he works on his. I mean, that's the point that he starts from. It feels like, and so it's interesting when I think of like kind of the spectrum of like of the state of nature folks, right? Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Hobbes being the one with the most chaotic and violent status of nature. It was like, it really illustrates it. Like there was no way that de Maistre and his work was going to be in any way emancipatory and in any way on the left, any way that wasn't just like trying to reinforce hierarchy, be classically right-wing. And it just makes a lot of sense that he would be the guy who would be a great influence to, I mean, if you think of someone like a Julius Evola, I mean, I just found an essay that Evola wrote on de Maistre.
Or Carl Schmitt.
And Carl Schmitt as well, right? And I wonder if Nietzsche had any sort of readings of de Maistre in his day, because it seems like, I mean, I don't know if you know anything about that at all, but I would be very curious to find that out.
Not to my knowledge. And Lacerdo actually talks a little bit about this, the connection between Nietzsche and Demeistre. Demeistre wrote a 1,000-page book on Nietzsche and says he couldn't find any textual references to Demeistre, aside from like glancing ones here and there, like not major textual references either. So it doesn't seem like it, right? But like there's a very interesting section in Lacerdo's book where he talks about the association between Demeistre's right-wing approach and Nietzsche's right-wing approach. And he says, let's just imagine we did put them in dialogue. What would they say? So what's interesting about Demeistre is Demeistre, again, makes this argument that society needs to be approached like a creed. And obviously he's very much a kind of throne and altar reactionary in the sense that he feels that political authority and religious authority complement one another, particularly Christian religious authority and the Ancien regime. And the reason is, of course, that we can see the king as being approximate to God on earth, right? And his authority is also ultimately backed up by God, so that never hurts, right? And in some cases, actually, Demeistre makes these very overt references to the revolutionaries as being rather Luciferian in their orientation. If you think about like John Lytton's Lucifer, right, as creative, intelligent, but ultimately destructive personalities who bring about extraordinary catastrophe precisely because they're too smart almost for their own good. Now, Nietzsche takes a very interesting tact where he says that the problem with reactionaries like Demeistre is Demeistre thinks that this throne and altar conservatism is the way to go, right? Because religion will provide, whether it's true or not, this pacifying function for the body politic. And Nietzsche says, what a load of, crock, right? If you actually read the gospel and you teach people the gospel, which is what the Catholic Church was doing all day long, then there are all kinds of quotations about blessed are the poor, my kingdom is not the same as the earthly kingdom. One day, the rich too will know their time, right?
Right.
All this kind of revolutionary egalitarian rhetoric is present within the gospel, right? And so Nietzsche says, you shouldn't be that surprised when the swinish multitude, to use Burke's phrase, sometimes at some point decides to take that seriously, right? And he makes this really interesting observation, Nietzsche does, right? Where he says, look, latent within Christianity was the idea that all human beings are equal before God, including the king. At best, the king was just the servant, a human servant of God on earth. That's not nearly hierarchical enough to get people to subordinate themselves in the way that somebody Demeistre would want. And so he's very critical of this notion that religion can serve, the Christian religion, can serve the kind of pacifying function that conservatives like Demeistre want it to, right? So it's a very interesting argument, kind of inter-right argument. And I actually happen to think that Nietzsche is right about this. I do see Christianity as ultimately egalitarian force within Western history. Now we have to be dialectical about that and appreciate that it's produced extraordinary forms of reaction as well. Sure. But over a long period of time, I think it's had this kind of historical impact.
Yeah, I think ultimately, when I began re-examining Nietzsche, when I realized that was the reason why he was ultimately upset with Christianity, was that he was it planted the seeds of egalitarian politics, which he would be outright hostile towards, as he wants an aristocratic sort of ruling class, right? And so I totally get that, and it's fascinating to hear that there was some sort of remarks made by Lacerdo about Nietzsche regarding De Maistre.
That book is a masterpiece. If people haven't read, it is a fucking brick. To have a stiff drink with you when you go through it, because you'll need several. But you will read it, and it's kind of like watching, all three Lord of the Rings movies, or at least the first two Godfathers. You'll think, God, I'm exhausted, but you will think fuck, I learned a lot. You know what I mean? Yeah,
and I think any of our listeners who listened to our episode with Ronald Biener discussing his books, Dangerous Minds, it's very Lacerdo's just like a marathon, if that's a 40-yard sprint kind of thing,
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly right. Biener's book, Ronnie's a great friend of mine, and I love that book. I wrote a good positive review of it. But it's almost like a fantastic appetizer before you get the feast. And the feast is sometimes too much, and you sometimes think I just can't have any more. But by the end of it, you think I'm fully satisfied. Yeah. And the reality is, I don't think that anybody in what's sometimes now being called our post-Lacerdo age can cogently hold on to the argument that Nietzsche is proto-leftist or proto-egalitarian anymore. if Boehner gives you some really juicy quotes, Lacerdo just gives you almost a literal mountain of evidence, being like, just read this and make of it what he's saying, and you'll come to the right conclusions.
And I mean, I think on that same kind of premise where like we have Ronald Boehner's, I keep calling him just Boehner, but Ronald Boehner's book, which is tiny like an appetizer, and you have Lacerdo's text, which is a feast. I think you could kind of make the same sort of like, if you listen to a couple of Isaiah Berlin lectures about like irrationalism, that's like a nice little appetizer. And if you really want to get into like the history of irrationalism, then you got to break open The Destruction of Reason, which is a really long book by itself too. But interestingly, I don't think Maistre is even mentioned inside The Destruction of Reason, which is why it was really nice to have like in the middle of all this research, while I'm researching Isaiah Berlin and reading your book and watching Ian Shapiro's lectures, to have Daniel Tutt and folks doing a 3-day 9-hour symposium on The Destruction of Reason was like really cool to have that at this specific time for in the middle of all this process.
No, absolutely, and I should just intervene and say I'm not a Lukács scholar by any means, and I have problems with let's just call it his Soviet fetishism, right? But all that aside, I do think that his work about the reification of the life world, and the forms that ideology takes in this kind of calcified, reified life world is extremely important, both for understanding our postmodern epoch generally, and also as an analytical tool to criticize the political right, since nobody was more talented at desublimating what conservatives want to sublimate than Lukács, right?
Right.
So take him with a grain of salt is always my philosophy, but definitely read History and Class Consciousness.
Yeah, and I think even just reading the introduction to The Destruction of Reason, like I'm not all that familiar with it, man. I hardly have time but I'm trying to like read as much as I can when I can. But just the statement of Lukács saying like there are no innocent philosophers. Like every philosopher that has contributed to this tradition has been forwarding thought in one way or another in ways they intended to or ways that were unintended, right? But at the end of the day, there are no innocent philosophers. And so this sort of course of the history of ideas and the history of thinkers as it regards to postmodern conservatism is something that like, I don't know. I mean, all these three texts to me seem like they're all covering around the same thing, and I've just been kind of swimming in them for a while. But I think your text, obviously being the shortest of the three, obviously, and kind of the most concise, has been the one that I found the most value out of, just because like that's the one that's been kind of guiding the path of what I've been reading throughout this stuff. But how do we get from? Because you mentioned the next author I wanted to ask you about was Michael Oakeshott, and so. And Oakeshott was an academic. He was like a professional academic. So I thought that his works and positions would be, rigorously spelled out. But you mentioned that he centered most of his work, developing a competing conception of traditionalist reason. And so I started to pick out like the same, because now that you've clarified the outlook thing, I get that now. But at the time I was like, damn, I'm picking up like Edmund Burke vibes from this guy, and that like he's not tied to premises or it's more of an outlook. And I had this thought that like, I'm always skeptical of like whenever like mysticism or spirituality gets mixed in with politics, because to me, like the spiritual aspect and stuff is kind of just an obscurant. It's like something to sort of cover over something else they don't want you to examine too closely. And so with De Maistre, I understood his kind of reasoning around that. And I understood that, Burke was more of an outlook than, but I just thought that it was like, taking something like organized premises that you could check off one by one that was concrete and systematized. Like, was Oakeshott kind of doing the same thing where he was like, I don't know, like he was like kind of creating something abstract or not concrete, maybe more of an outlook than a system or a list of premises. I just what I'm trying to ask about Oakeshott is like, can you kind of pick up where this thread leaves off from De Maistre? Like, how do we get from Burke and De Maistre over to Michael Oakeshott? Because I mean, the guy just died in 1990, so he's kind of a contemporary. I think we've gotten to that point where we're discussing a bit of a more contemporary thinker at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting, Perry Anderson, in his seminal essay on the right, claimed that the four greatest conservative or right-wing, I'll use them a bit interchangeably, thinkers of the 20th century were F.A. Hayek, Leo Strauss, Carl Schmitt, and Michael Oakeshott, right? And of those four, I think there's no doubt that Oakeshott is the one that people hear the least about. Right.
Right.
No, I devote a lot of time to talking about Schmidt in the book later on. Don't really spend that much time talking about Hayek or Strauss, but I do in my new book. So,
oh, wow. Cool,
shameless plug there.
Yeah.
But look, I think what is important to note about Michael Oakeshott is that, as you pointed out, Burke's work is notoriously unsystematic. And there are even conservative thinkers, like, for instance, Russell Kirk, who complain about that you kind of have to glean or infer lessons from it that are of general applicable use, which in of itself can seem like a paradoxical project when you think that, this is supposed to be very much an experiential kind of outlook, right? Nevertheless, there are people who've tried to transform this into a kind of rigorous intellectual enterprise inspired by Burkeanism. And Oakeshott is probably the most spectacular example of that, in my view. So he started off his career as kind of a right-wing Hegelian, then gradually transitioned to adopting or developing a pretty comprehensive philosophy on his own right, centered around this idea of anti-rationalism, right? Now, you might say that seems in itself kind of self-contradictory. How can you make a theoretical argument for anti-rationalism? And a lot of people have criticized Oakeshott for this. But the way he talks about it is like this. Look, generally speaking, on the left, there's this predisposition to want to rationalize the world. And what he's thinking about in his own time is utilitarian radicalism, right? This idea that we shouldn't let traditions, conventions, the way people have been doing things stand in our way. If we can think of a way of reorganizing society that would seem to give us a bigger utility boom, then that's what we should just do. Like, go ahead and do it, right? And this is important when it comes to things, for instance, the UK, like the decriminalization of homosexuality, right? A lot of people would argue, look, there's no utilitarian argument for criminalizing homosexuality. The only reason that people don't want this is pure bigotry. But if it'll make people happier for them to love who they want, then let them do it. And by the way, I completely agree with that argument, right? And Oakeshott says, look, to be a conservative is to prefer the familiar, the well-known, the practiced to the innovative, progressive, and even the rational, at least in this sense. And the way he tries to avoid giving a purely irrational argument for anti-rationalism is to say, look, there is a kind of reason underpinning this yearning for familiarity. And he uses all kinds of homey, down-to-earth examples for it, where he'll say, look, you get up, you walk down the street, and you go buy a pack of cigarettes, right? You probably don't spend a lot of time thinking to yourself, like, well, here's the geometrical overlay of the street. This is what money is, and this is why I can exchange it for these goods. I'm going to buy cigarettes even though it's not medically, all that kind of stuff. You don't think about that. You do it because it's a habit, right? And you've been inculcated into that community, and so you kind of know what's going to happen when you walk down the street. You go, you talk about the game with the guy at the desk, and then you walk off, you have your smoke, and you go, right? And Oakeshott's kind of implicit belief is that most people are by nature people who will adopt this kind of conservative orientation towards their life, preferring the familiar to the innovative, the progressive, and the rational, at least in this progressive sense. And consequently, he says they will fight, and they should fight, he believes, to inhibit transformations that radically transform those ways of living, even if there might seem to be a scientific or utilitarian argument for doing so. And I mean, he develops this in an even more elaborate way in later books like On Human Conduct, where he kind of develops this very robust philosophical anthropology to defend the position. I should say that ultimately I think this argument is really bad, but it's well articulated, okay? It's not really bad. It's a powerful argument that I fundamentally disagree with, that's well articulated and kind of given a sustained line of argumentation. And a lot of people, for instance, people here might know Richard Rorty. Oakeshott's work is often compared to Rorty's work, even though Rorty was a kind of pragmatist of the left and Oakeshott was obviously a man of the right. But if you read their books, there's a lot of epistemological similarities between them at the very least.
Gotcha. All right, so we got through Maistre, we got through Burke, Maistre, and then Oakeshott. And so as we wrap up this portion of the conversation about some of the genealogy of postmodern thinkers who helped form postmodern conservatism, I wonder if you'd say a few words about Peter Lawler, because I know that I wonder how his work and how he contributed basically to our understanding of postmodern conservatism as you frame it in your book.
Well, he didn't actually very much, and this is the reason I more or less included a section on him, because Lawler is probably the figure most associated with the term postmodern conservatism. And by the way, unlike Wolin and myself, he didn't mean it critically. He actually identified as a, quote, postmodern conservative. Right. He had a blog with that effect. And look, Lawler was a pretty smart guy, a bigot, but a pretty smart guy. And the argument that he makes is, look, modernity is defined, again, by a number of different features. I'll just give you a few of them. This political commitment to equality and freedom, and a kind of metaphysical commitment, this is pretty important, to nominalism, right? By which he means the idea that there's no intrinsic essence to anything. Everything is just matter and motion, the way that, for instance, Hobbes would talk about it. And the reason this is important is you have a society predicated on freedom and equality and metaphysical nominalism, and this will lead to a society where people will say things like, look, if I want to change who I am, change my physical being in some way, shape, or form, why shouldn't I be allowed to do that? That's my choice. No one has any kind of authority over me to tell me I shouldn't do that. So if I want to adopt a trans identity, that's one that he really criticizes. Let me go ahead and do that, right? And Lawler, like a lot of conservatives, will say, look, understood in this way, both liberalism and socialism and Marxism are all modernist doctrines, right? In the sense that they all believe in human equality, human liberty. They just think that there are different ways of achieving this ultimate end, that you'll be able to have more opportunities for creative expression and self-transformation under socialism than you will under than liberalism or capitalism, right?
Right.
And Lawler says, as a postmodern conservative, what I'm committed to is the idea that we're going to reject this kind of modernity wholesale, right? Now, I think the post thing is a little bit misleading. It's designed to kind of give a bit of a sex appeal to what really amounts to we need to go back before modernity to a more reactionary disposition. He didn't quite feel that way because he says, look, there are parts of modernity that we need to carry on with. This is why I'm a postmodern conservative. I don't really buy that, and he tended to become more right-wing as time went on. So,
right.
I think it's insincere. But there are some interesting insights to be gleaned from his work from a left-wing perspective. For instance, if you're trying to understand post-liberalism now, which is a major movement on the right that he was quite influential on. So, Lawler, I'm not really very influenced by him.
Sure.
I had that section in because I thought, well, if I don't add it in, somebody's going to give me shit for it, basically, right? So there you go. There's the section. But
okay.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Not much to say about that.
All right. So your book, you go from there's this history of ideas and how postmodernism emerges as as a cultural thing within neoliberal societies, and you trace that history, and then we went through the genealogy of thinkers, and then as you get out of the individuals, you start to name sort of contemporary movements that seem to just be like nationalist movements, right? Here we are in the year of our Lord 2022, and by scanning the horizon, one could make an argument that we're in something like a Weimar 2.0. I mean, the far right and nationalism is on the rise.
Fucking God forbid, right? I can't deal with that. If we see a real reboot of the Weimar Republic, and that's the future we're headed to, then just fucking kill me now.
I just fucking, I said something the other day on Twitter that caught on that was just kind of like every 80 years now we're going to have to kill a bunch of Nazis. It's kind of the meta-narrative of history at this point. It's the historical memory just fucking cuts off, and then we forget everything. And, I saw this, obviously, there's not a whole lot of surviving World War II veterans around or something, but Jesus Christ, man. And the other side of that is that every person that is a Nazi is saying, no, that we're fighting the Nazis. We're fighting the vaccine mandate shit or whatever the fuck, and it's wow, so not only are we going to have to re-up on doing away with a bunch of Nazis every 80 years, but every 80 years those Nazis we have to take care of are going to be insisting that they are not the actual Nazis, which is just really weird and postmodern within itself. Yeah, man. So I just wonder, man, these far right and nationalist movements, what makes these movements postmodern?
Okay, well, I mean, that's a great question. It's obviously at the heart of my book, right? And what I argue is that this kind of genealogy that I construct isn't intended, as you pointed out, to suggest that Burke was kind of a proto-postmodernist. Some people have actually uncharitably interpreted my text that way. Mostly conservatives who didn't bother to read it. Huge surprise right? But anyway, putting all that aside, my point is look, there are these kind of irrationalist, anti-enlightenment dimensions to conservatism that were there from the very beginning. And conservatives agree with that. It's not like I'm reading that into these texts. Just go read Russell Kirk. That's what he would say, or Oakeshott, or any of the other people you mentioned. And these have had a profound impact on the way that conservatives understand themselves and right-wing culture across the Euro-American world generally. And subject to the right conditions, these very much could mutate into postmodern forms, which is what I argue has happened, right? And the reason I say this has happened is, look, postmodernism is a ubiquitous cultural moment for many developed states at this point. I shouldn't even say just Euro-America, because I also point out that this is happening in Brazil and to some extent India as well. And so, it shouldn't be a surprise that given this is the ubiquitous cultural soil in which we're all planted, that you're going to see postmodern form of conservative sprung up, right? And what I say distinguishes postmodern forms of conservatism from earlier forms of conservatism is, one, and this is a pretty simple point, they adopt the rhetoric, tactics, and kind of political tropes that are associated with postmodernity, including on the left more generally. It's not surprised that a lot of those Nazi types don't want to call themselves Nazis. They call themselves white identitarians who are concerned about being victimized in their own culture or marginalized in their own culture, right?
Right.
And the political right has always been good at appropriating left-wing rhetoric, but never quite so as reflectively as we see right now, right? But the second sense in which I say that postmodern conservatism is a distinctly postmodern phenomena is that in the postmodern era, where we are kind of compelled to transform ourselves into forms of human capital in the way I talked about earlier, right? What we really see is the dissolution of a lot of traditional sources of selfhood, right? And part of this has nothing to do with just us at the individual level. It's the way that society, as Marx predicted, constantly transforms itself around us. And so a lot of the ways that we would think of ourselves as being who we are change so rapidly that there's really no stability to our identity any longer. And for some progressives, including anti-capitalist ones, a life devoted to constant self-transformation wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, per se, right?
Sure.
There's this kind of idea that we can engage in projects of self-creation. There's also the fact that with the dissolution of traditional sources of the self, you see the breakdown of socially conservative mores, for example, that open space for historically marginalized groups to be included in the political community. So there are good things from a left perspective about postmodernity, also bad things, but we'll get to that, right? But for a conservative, this dissolution of traditional sources of the self is a nightmare, right? Because many conservatives are very attached to the idea that we live in an orderly universe, right? Again, where everyone knows their place, and society is a kind of organic whole that's organized hierarchically. This goes back to Burke. So the idea that we now live in a society where identity is constantly in flux, where people go up and down the social hierarchy, is associated with the notion that there's no more stability any longer. So the way that they'll try to deal with this is by attaching themselves onto historically dominant identity groups that they think once upon a time were able to stabilize society and that can provide them with a sense of identity and meaning in the kind of morass of postmodernity, right? But the way that they identify with these groups, and I point about to the nation, religion, ethnicity, race as all good examples, the way that they associate with these, though, is subtly different than the way that people would have associated with those groups before. Because once upon a time, people didn't take a respective stance, including conservatives, towards their identity, right? They just believed they were who they were. But the way that postmodern conservatives associate with these identities is very much through this kind of reflective process of searching out these sources of selfhood on things like the internet and kind of arranging them, and this is Jameson's term, into pastiche, like assemblage, which often means that the sources of their identity, if you try to break them down logically, don't always cohere with one another all that well. You can have people claim to be white Christian nationalists, and you think, well, isn't Christianity a universalistic religion? Doesn't the nation often include people of many different skin colors? But it's not intended to make literal sense, right? The idea is that they're attaching to it for affective reasons, above all else, right? And then the third sense, I suppose, in which postmodern conservatism is distinctly postmodern, and I point this out, is that postmodern conservatives do adopt this kind of skeptical attitude toward the epistemic claims of Enlightenment rationality, particularly areas where Enlightenment rationality is associated with progressive causes, like, say, the environment, right? Or on immigration issues, where people will throw facts at them saying, there's just really no debate in the science anymore that the environment is being damaged by capitalism, or at least by industrialization, or really there's no doubt the fact that many migrants are fundamental contributors to our society, commit crimes at lower rates than normal people, etc. These kind of things, they'll appeal to every skeptical trick under the book in order to avoid believing in them. By the way, I wrote this before the whole anti-vax thing. So
oh yeah,
in some ways I wish I could rewrite the book now, because I would sit there and be like, if you didn't believe what I was saying then, fucking tell me I'm wrong now. Right. But this skepticism doesn't really go very far. And again, this is very much a kind of conservative trope that you see going back to people like Burke, because it applies only to the kind of epistemic claims of the Enlightenment, right? They are very willing to adhere to the kind of epistemological and moral claims made by figures that they identify with and that they see as sources of stability and order in society. Usually figureheads like Trump or Viktor Orban, but there are others, conservative pundits, you name it, right? So it's what I called a strategic epistemic skepticism. One day I'll be sitting there talking about how you need to question the truth of the science and be a critical thinker and think for yourself and whatever. But then if Ben Shapiro tells you a bunch of dumb dogmatic stuff the next day, you'll just buy into it, right?
Right.
And again, I point out that one can't necessarily understand these things as a philosophy, right? Postmodern conservatism is a kind of symptom of our postmodern culture. And so if you try to understand it philosophically, it'll make very little sense, because of course there's all kinds of incoherences, tensions, bizarre manifestations of what I'm talking about. But when you understand it as a symptom of our postmodern culture and our neoliberal society, it makes a lot more sense why you'd see this kind of reactionary politics emerge.
I mean,
so that's kind of me summarizing the last 2 chapters of the book in a nutshell.
I mean, I really appreciate everything you're telling us here, man. Just like, I think the phrase of the day is strategic epistemic skepticism. Because it's
a mouthful, anyway.
But it totally makes sense, man. I mean, it's like, I always wondered how, like, they somehow the incoherence is consistent to them, in that they can do their own research and kind of, believe in science to the degree that they are willing to allow themselves, and deploy that wherever it's convenient to their worldviews, and yet, sort of pull away from that when it comes to any sort of science that might benefit like the collective whole, or be it for a progressive cause, or, so that sheds a lot of light on deciphering the behavior of, and I don't want to say belief system, but like the behavior, at least, of contemporary conservatives.
Did you see Steven Crowder?
What? Yeah.
Our good old racist Steve.
Right.
He gave just a spectacular example of this last year, where he was vigorously anti-vax, vigorously anti-medicine, talked all about the medical industry, how horrible it was. And then, of course, when he had a medical condition, he went right to the hospital.
Right,
And all of a sudden, all the science is vindicated again. Now, that's not me trying to sit there and call him a hypocrite, because I understand that people have changes of heart. Sure. But it's noteworthy that he had a change of heart when his own safety was what was at issue. Right? Yeah,
and like I will say that, like, isn't that kind of what's necessary at times to make a non-believer have a latent life conversion? Is this sort of like threat to their own personal well-being that it produces a change of heart or a change of mind or something to that end? I mean, I feel like radicalization comes out of, like, poverty, oppression, being subjugated and stuff like that. So, like, to leap to actually be pushed over what one is resistant to, whether it's like transformative change or it's just like, I don't know, retracting on a deeply, firmly held belief, like it totally makes sense that, like, it would only be something that would threaten the guy's immediacy of his experience, right? His health is that would cause someone like that to have a change of mind. So, but again, it goes back to this sort of strategic deployment of the skepticism, right? At that point, it wasn't especially convenient, and now that he's better, he'll probably go back to having this sort of epistemic skepticism towards vaccines anyway. So it's kind of altogether reminiscent of, like, aspects of fascism, where it's like simultaneously, like the Jewish people can be like this conniving, powerful, all-knowing thing, right? But then also they're weak and they're despicable and they are beneath you, and so they're simultaneously super powerful and simultaneously super small and not powerful. So it's like this: the enemy can be anything and anything you need at any particular moment, given the conditions that you are working through, which is all part of this sort of strategic deployment shit that we're talking about.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And this is why I think Benjaminian ideology analysis is so important for understanding the phenomena that I'm talking about, right? Because the example you gave is excellent. And I think that you see that more ubiquitously than ever before. I mean, you can sometimes see people in the National Review in the same column talk about leftists as dumb, out of touch, apparently inconsequential, and also the most lethal threat to the United States at the moment. And you think that there's an extraordinary incoherence conceptually about holding both of these positions to be true. But ideologically, it's necessary, because if we claim that they're smart, then that might be there's something to what they have to say, right? If we claim that they're weak, well, there's no reason to actually mobilize against them. So it's essential for them to both be dumb, but powerful, right? Or inconsequential, but at the same time ubiquitous. Because vacillating between these two kind of positions will mobilize the outlook that's important politically. And this is the way that ideology tends to function. And again, understanding it at the level of a philosophy would be wrong, because then you'd sit there and just say this is incoherent. But when you grasp it ideologically and as symptomatic of the broader cultural moment, then all of a sudden it makes quite a bit of sense, from my perspective, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think your book is providing some much needed clarity on a lot of this stuff, man. And it's certainly kind of parsed things out for me. It's made me understand, like, rather than scratching my head at the contradictions, I'm kind of like, oh, those two things are in contradiction. Yeah, that makes perfect sense given the sort of overall incoherence, and receiving this as an ideology, not as any tied tenets of beliefs or systematic things. It's not even like that. It's like it all goes back to this this outlook kind of concept that we spoke about with Burkeanism and stuff like that. But I have one more question for you, Matt, and I think we have time for this, hopefully. So I've made my way through most of your book, man, but I have not made it to your conclusion. And there you go through what you've titled a, quote, an egalitarian agenda for the future. So I trust you have much helpful advice within there for how our society can both overcome, the popular movements of our time and cure our postmodern condition. But in all seriousness, man, your book really does provide so much needed clarity, and I've found tremendous value in it. And I wonder if you might tell us about some of your suggestions for a modernizing left democracy for a postmodern epoch.
Sure, absolutely. Well, just to kind of segue out of the postmodern conservatism thing, I end the book by pointing out that postmodernism, conservatism, as fundamentally a symptom and even a radicalization of all the tendencies within neoliberal society and postmodern culture, is utterly inequipped to actually resolving them. And so the kind of tragic irony of it is that the people who support it are buying into a movement that's only going to exacerbate all the tendencies that they claim to hate, right? Now, this isn't the first time in history that we've seen this happen, but it's always sad when it does, right? I think the way to go forward that actually could resolve these tensions is the left route. And in that book, I obviously don't give too many specifications. It's mainly a work of critique. But, in a lot of my other projects, I kind of spell out what it is that I think would be the solution, right? So, for instance, I argue that what we need to do is see a recentering of the labor movement in contemporary left politics, and the way that we can kind of innovate on the developments in the 1950s and the 1960s is by demanding more stringent and more powerful kinds of workplace democracy, right? I think one of the big mistakes with the welfarist and social democratic movements, even though they accomplished something, was the fact that they never really transformed the relationship between labor, the state, and capital. And as a result, once you had the kind of Reagan revolutions, the Thatcher revolutions come in, they just basically swept away a lot of the minimal reforms that have been carried out, and things went back to an even nastier version of the status quo before things like the Depression. Right? Workplace democracy could permanently change this power relation. Right? So that's something that I think that we can do. Right? Another thing that I think is extremely important is that there was this real temptation in the 1950s and 60s, again, the kind of heyday of the left movement, to buy into a kind of nation-state socialism. And I know that a lot of people are still attracted to this, people like John Judas. And I mean, I understand it. I think it's important. I'm not saying don't agitate at the level of the nation state, right? Obviously, if you can get your fucking local town councilor and he's a DSA guy into office, then by all means do that and pour your energy into it. But the problem with just focusing on the nation state level is that capital is more global system than it ever has been before. The power of capital is more globalized than it's ever been before. So just operating at the level of the nation state is inevitably going to lead to catastrophe, especially when there's inevitably going to be a pushback from global capital if you happen to achieve something like temporary democratic socialism, even in a country as big as the United States. So we really need to think globally, as the phrase goes, right? Achieve local change, but always have the big picture in mind. And when it comes to that, I really don't know strategically how to go about it. There are a lot of activists who are way smarter than I am on these kind of points who could tell you a lot more about what the right tactics and the right kind of paths would be, right? And the last kind of thing that I want to say on this is I think that the left needs to be more willing to advocate for principled and down-to-earth changes that could make a difference, a material difference in the lives of ordinary people. And this is where I'm kind of softly critical of what I call the postmodern left. Now, I point out that, look, the postmodern left has achieved a lot for progressive causes, right? In no small part by criticizing dominant discourses and forms of ideology that inhibited people from living the kind of lifestyles that they wanted. And we've created a lot of political space to include previously marginalized groups into the conversation. We need to continue doing that. We shouldn't stop. But we need to tie these efforts to a more universalistic project that says, look, all human beings, regardless of your identity, want things like healthcare, want things like working in a workplace where you're treated with respect, want to not have to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to pay your fucking bill and live in your house next month. We should be trying to achieve this for everyone, right? And I think that the Bernie Sanders campaign was a good start in that direction. Building a mass coalition that included people of color, LGBTQ individuals, women, and workers, right? But obviously, we didn't win, so we need to do a lot more next time. Who knows? Maybe AOC, she turns 35 in I think it's 2024. Hopefully she runs for office, and then everyone can vote for her, and I can come over from the Canadian border and pick it on her behalf or something. We'll see.
Yeah. I hear you, man. I as a Marxist and a Leninist, man, it's really difficult for me to buy into any sort of strategy that includes electoral politics. I mean, I know that we probably have a lot of disagreements there between you and I, but I think the one thing that we can agree on is the recentering of the labor movement as kind of a focus to the left is direly needed. I think we can totally more than agree on that. But dude, listen, man, as a person who's listened to you talk on PillPod for quite some time and has thought about sending you an email for a little while too, this has been a wonderful discussion. You've answered all my questions, and we've somehow done this within exactly an hour. And so I really appreciate.
It's a miracle, eh?
Yeah, man, and I know you're super busy with all your students and your classes and stuff, bro. So I just thank you sincerely for sitting down and talking to me. It really means a lot, and you've shed a lot of light. And like I said, there's a lot of you give us a lot of much needed clarity in your book, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism. And I'll be sure to plug your stuff in the show notes. But if you want to tell listeners where we can find you online or what your next work is, if you can tell us anything about it.
Sure. Just really quickly, you can have me at Matt Paulfroth on Twitter. That's kind of the primary way you get in touch with me on social media or on Facebook. Secondly, I have a couple of big projects coming up. I guess two that I'll foreground that might be of interest to people who read the Postmodern Conservatism book is I have a new book on postmodernity generally, not postmodern conservatism, just the postmodern condition. That's with Palgrave. It should be coming out this year pretty soon. The proofs are being edited right now, so date to come. The next thing I'm working on is actually a book for Routledge, and it's just an intellectual history of the political right from a left perspective. And this is going to be a little different than the last one. It's not going to be me kind of diagnosing conservatism as a symptom of whatever. It's just going to be a straightforward, here are the smartest conservatives, and here's an argument for each of them as to why they're just all wrong. You know what I mean? Even if occasionally they have some insights that are worth paying attention to. So that'll come out. I don't know when. I still have to write the fucking thing, but it'll be out hopefully 2023, 24 or something. Okay?
Gotcha. Well, Matt McManus, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. I so appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope I can bring you back on this show later on to maybe, I was thinking about doing a liberalism for communists, covering all the Johns, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, all these, maybe Jean-Paul Marat somewhere in there or something. I don't know.
John Lennon. Yeah,
John Lennon, right? All the J's, man. Yeah. All right, Matt, thanks so much, man. I'll catch you later, and have a great day, and thank you again, brother.
Yeah, peace, dude.
Save you a panda plank!